at work with another Wolff responds. I want to draw a historical parallel. On the one hand, how feudalism, the system that preceded capitalism in Europe, died, and to learn from that death something about the processes that bring about the end of a system, because I think they're at play in capitalism right now. We can learn from history, or we can be condemned to repeat it, and in the hope of not doing the latter, I want to do a little learning from history. Feudalism began as a highly decentralized system. Across the European continent, after the fall of the Roman Empire, relationships of the different parts of the Roman Empire fell apart. Countries, regions, areas, localities went their own way and formed their own small or not so small feudal arrangements, lords and serfs, little lords with a few serfs, medium lords with a medium number of serfs, and huge lords with large numbers of serfs. But it was a decentralized system. You might, to use modern language, call it a private feudalism. But over the centuries, roughly from the 5th to the 13th or 14th centuries, a long time, 1,000 years almost, this private feudalism encountered more and more difficulties. It overcame some, it changed along the way, and then it reached a point, starting already in the 11th or 12th centuries and building after that, where it could no longer sustain the private kind of feudalism it had, small, large, and medium lords with their serfs, and it turned to the biggest lords among them, and it eventually crowned them, one of them, with literally a crown, and made that big lord with his many serfs something we came to call the king, the chief, the biggest lord of them all. And it was his job to coordinate, to organize. And at first it was difficult because the smaller, medium, and even large lords didn't want one of their number, even if he was the biggest, to tell them what to do, to take charge, to be the leader. On the other hand, they needed the help of the big lord when they had their increasing difficulties both with one another and, of course, the big problem, their relationship with the serfs, who were forever trying to free themselves from feudalism, grab a little more independence, grab a little more liberty from the dominance of the lord. So the medium and small lords needed the king to enforce feudalism. And so slowly, over those centuries, we got no longer the private feudalism, but we got state-dominated, state-controlled feudalism. And we gave that a new name. We called it the era of the absolute monarchies. Those stories we still hear about how the kings of France and England and Spain warred with one another, mobilizing and controlling and taxing everybody else for the enlargement of their power as the king, sometimes with the approval of the other lords, often over their opposition. We developed modern taxation, the way the king got the resources, forcing the lower lords to pony up the money if they wanted the protection from the king. The king had to be strong, had to have a big army, all of the rest of it. State feudalism, monarchy, became the way feudalism survived. But the price of surviving was eventually a level of competition that blew feudalism up. Those big, powerful, absolute monarchies, the Elizabeths in England, the Catherine the Greats in Russia, and so on, and everyone in between. They put such taxes on their people, they bankrupt their system. They put such limits on people's freedom that they eroded whatever support they had, and in the end, they went to devastating wars with one another from which none of them recovered, paving the way for the English revolutions in the 17th century, the American and French revolutions in the 18th century that were the end of feudalism. Why do I tell you this? Because the parallel is with capitalism. Private capitalism, a system in which an employer hires a few workers, a nice medium number of workers, huge numbers of workers. That system, too, like private feudalism, is on its way out. It cannot manage its tensions, its contradictions. Look at us here. We are now struggling through the worst collapse of capitalism in a century. The third one in this new century of the 21st century. We had the dot-com crisis in 2000, the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008, and now the coronavirus crisis in 2020. Get the picture? Every few years, this system tanks, and it has for a long time. But now, with the international supply chains where we get so much of our inputs into our lives from far distant places, a crisis anywhere has become a crisis everywhere. We are destroying the planet, a little bit like in feudalism they exhausted the fertility of the soil, having not figured out how to deal with that problem. We're exhausting our entire planet, and we haven't figured out how to deal with it either. The system is unraveling. And in that unraveling, clearly something is going on that I want your attention focused on. The United States capitalism, to take the major example for us, is now a capitalism that relies overwhelmingly on the government. The government is sustaining all the unemployed with unemployment insurance. Not very well, but something. It has just allocated more money than anyone ever imagined, trillions of dollars, to keep business afloat. The Federal Reserve is now directly lending money to corporations by buying their bonds. The government is financing, in short, everything. In other countries, this has been going on for a while. Japan has been doing it in its way. People's Republic of China has been doing it in its way, often with this financial arm being given. But the difference between state and private capitalism is dissolving. The state is becoming the powerful capitalist of last resort, kind of like it did in feudalism. And so the question is, are we coming to the end? And I think the reversion to a powerful state to keep capitalism going is also a sign of history repeating itself with capitalism, and thereby suggesting that, like every other system, capitalism was born, capitalism evolved over time, and capitalism's next stage is that increasing reliance on a powerful state. Unfortunately, with a number of powerful states, China, US, Japan, Europe, just like those absolute monarchies at the end of feudalism. It's a very dangerous parallel, but it's one we ought to think about if there's to be any chance to avoid the disasters that may otherwise unfold.